So we're missing, John too?
John's here.
John Morgan?
Yes, John Morgan's not here, correct?
It's a tease. It's teasing us, the weather.
So we're missing John Morgan, Jake Thomas, Rick Ladd, and David Ryan. David said he was not gonna be able to make it.
That's right.
Of course.
And the others have showed up over there and now everyone's voting. Right?
Yeah, well, we emailed them last
Yeah, I
night,
did.
so they'll know. So, you all ready? We'll call the, meeting to order. It's 2:00 now, so good time to start. We'll call the meeting of the Commission to Study School Funding to order. Today's March 9th, 2020 at 2:00. And thank everybody for joining us in what may become our new location here at Business and Economic Affairs Department Conference Room. It's just a little bit of an overview here. This is a conference room that is used quite often by various groups in the legislature and in state government, and it's sort of come to our attention that the state government is trying to make better use throughout all of its facilities in terms of being able to hold large meetings and conferences and things like that, so that we're not always at the legislative office building. So one of the things I'm hoping to find out after our meeting today is really how well did this work out for everybody? And not just talking about people around the table, but members of the community, members of the public, and making sure that it's meeting your needs, that it's comfortable, that it's easy to get to, and all of that. So after our meeting today, you might take a minute, or just come up to me after the meeting and let me know what you think. So anyway, that's why we're here this afternoon. Let's see, before we get into, or too deep into our agenda, I think copies of the minutes from our March 2nd meeting have gone around, and they look like this.
And there are extra copies over in the little cubby or little chest over there if anybody else needs.
So if everybody can give them a quick look-see, and when anybody is ready, I would certainly take a motion to approve the minutes.
So moved.
Second.
Is there a second? Is there any discussion or clarifications or changes, deletions, amplifications anybody would like to offer? Seeing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? The minutes carry. Heading into the rest of the agenda, I think I'm just gonna hand it over to Bruce to lead us through group agreements, calendar, and what's coming up for presentation.
All right, thank you. And we'll all have to sort of lean in a little bit so we can make eye contact with each other. But it feels like a kind of environment where we can have real conversations and share information, and hopefully the tech will work for our presenters that are coming in today at other meetings. Just a quick reminder, again, of the agreements we established for ourselves to adhere to, and the suggestion, as always, pick one from those that you might want to keep in mind today, and make sure you especially follow through on. I find listening first is a good one for me. As a 40-year college professor, I need to reverse my tendency to be the first one to talk. So in any case, we'll reaffirm those. On your agenda for today, you see the calendar for our upcoming meetings with the topics and the times. We recognize that we're shifting back and forth, been shifting back and forth a little bit about morning versus afternoon. The intention is to hold these meetings from 2 to 4 on Monday afternoons. We had a couple of instances where we had to modify that slightly. So you'll see 2 weeks out, March 23rd, we'll be meeting at noon, otherwise in the afternoon. And we'll continue to try to advance this calendar so you can anticipate where these fall. Later on today, before the meeting ends, we're going to talk about ways to potentially restructure the way that we work together, which may have some calendar implications, but we'll get back to that later. And again, you see the topics that are laid out there. As the commission does its work, it will identify additional areas that it wants to dig in deep on, which may now show up on the calendar as we go along as well. It says on the agenda that, for an update on our contract between the commission and the Carsey School. This is not the RFP, which is standing in the gates, ready to be released as soon as the overall contract between the university and the legislature is agreed upon. It's under current review by Terry Pfaff in the legislative services. Is that right?
Well, in
It's-
the chief operating officer
Yeah,
for
CEO,
the
right.
house. Right.
And his counterpart in the university system, so we anticipate the next day or two, I hope that will be resolved and executed. The Carsey School will be posting its own website for the commission. The intention is to get that up this week. This will complement the general court's website that of course maintains for the commission, which is pretty limited. We have more opportunity to provide resources and links, communication channels, including receiving input from folks who go to the website. We'll be inviting people to visit our website and make comments or ask questions that we can respond to. We've also established an email specific to this commission. We posted up here, school funding, all one word, .commission@unh.edu. So again, we'll make that known to the general public and to the stakeholders in this process. That's another place where people can either make comments or ask questions. That comes to Carrie and Jordan and me. We forward those to Dave and Jay and Mel at least, or to the entire commission. So we'll keep a running record that way of what the comments are and what the questions are that we're getting from the public. So we're beginning to have a little bit more outward facing process here for the commission, which will be critical obviously as we go deeper into the work. Any questions about any of that from the commission?
So before we get into presentations today, do you want to take a minute and talk about the stakeholders meeting that?
Oh, yeah, sure, we can do that. Yeah, we have time here. We're a bit ahead of ourselves.
Oh, did we have that somewhere?
I made a note to myself to do it
okay.
in the discussion,
Okay.
but we told our ECS friends would be on 2:15.
Right.
So sure, we can say that last Thursday, we invited what we call education stakeholders, key stakeholders, to come together for about an hour and a half briefing to help them understand what the commission is doing, what its charge is, what its timeline is, who's on it. And then also we asked them to give us input, just as we did in the commission a few weeks ago. We asked those key stakeholders, what are your hopes, concerns, and questions for the commission as it gets started? So the invitees were representatives of the New Hampshire School Boards Association, School Administrators Association, Association of School Principals, Association of Special Education Administrators, New Hampshire Charitable Foundation, who else? Reaching Higher, thank you. And then other members of the public, Doug and others also, and some of the folks in this room came as well, following our calendar. And so that was the group there. The School Administrators Association and School Principals Association, unfortunately, for conflicts, I guess, were not able to be there, so we'll follow up with them and give them some separate update on the commission. What we heard from that group as a whole, the themes, the concerns, the questions, were very similar to what this commission has already essentially put on the table. So I think if you had been there, I'm going to ask Val in a second to comment on what you observed and heard. So Val was able to attend. Jay came towards the very end of the meeting. In any case, what we heard, I think, resonated. We have pretty detailed minutes from that meeting. And I'll say that the concerns that we heard are ones that I expect are shared in the commission here as well. Again, there were about 40 of them that are listed here, but for example, what about unfunded mandates? Will the commission be considering the true costs of an active education, including the cost of the mandates, the federal and state funded mandates? We also heard, given who was in the room, a concern legislative session has traction, and as somebody said, it can't just get kicked down the road. In other words, that there will be a movement from the recommendations that you make to legislative action on the other end. We know that that's a challenging process, but that was a concern and a hope that was expressed. And that the process itself of the commission, the recommendations, and the process afterwards will be a bipartisan process, that the recommendations that come out will have support of a strong bipartisan coalition or group in the legislature and then out in the general public as well. We know that's much easier said than done, but that's a hope that we all want to sort of keep in front of us as we go forward here, if we're going to have hopes that the legislature will be able to act on this. Val, any comments about?
No, I think I covered it pretty well. There was a reasonable representation from the stakeholders. I think the concerns that you mentioned were pretty much the same that we talked about here. I think it was important for them to understand the depth that this commission is going into, that the funding to support our mission is much more extensive than perhaps what had been available in the past. So there was maybe some members who thought we should be jumping to the conclusion pretty quickly, but I think we made it clear that this is going to be much more deliberative and data-driven and analytically driven than perhaps previous attempts were. So hopefully that will be a much more fair and inclusive output when we're done with it.
Great, thanks. Any questions from the commission about that meeting? Anyway, I thought it was a good thing to do, a lot of interest and commitment to it. Oh, I didn't mention that the representative of the New Hampshire Council of Business and Education was also there as well. Fred Duarte represented.
Did you say that you have a list of points who were made?
Oh, yes.
And are we getting that, or is it on the site or what?
It's pretty raw. We can send it out to all of you, sure.
Yeah, and also those who spoke up, is that part of the notes?
We didn't record who said what in that process, although we have a video, we have a complete video, including audio, of the meeting that we can send you a YouTube link to. That was just completed today. A lot of people do that. We'll send that out to everybody. Good. It's hard for me to remember that this is what you like to do after dinner in the evenings. Read these videos and read transcripts. And
Just love it.
Well, it is baseball season.
Jay
Spring training.
Jake and Marianne, we're just talking about the stakeholders meeting.
I'm sure Val covered it well. As did you.
With that, we have our colleagues from Denver, from the Education Commission of the States, with us. I think you all were involved in helping to shape the ask to Joel Moore and Mary Fulton. They're going to help us get a national perspective on how states have addressed the very similar kinds of challenges that New Hampshire is facing, both in terms of fiscal policy and adequacy, especially on the adequacy side. I think that's the Education Commission's expertise, is trying to figure out what goes into these constitutionally mandated and required adequate education policies around the country. We asked them to highlight especially the approaches in Massachusetts more recently, as well as Vermont and New Jersey, and I think they'll comment from other states as well. But we've asked them to provide 30 minutes or so of presentation, and then time for Q&A, and now we'll see if the audio technology is actually going to work. I'll turn it over to Joel and Mary. And I guess we're not hearing you yet. Where is the sound coming through? Question.
Should be coming to the TV.
Is the power on this?
Might they have theirs on mute?
It doesn't look like they're on mute. Are you on mute, are you?
Are they giving you hand signals?
You can use the chat side if you want chat. Oh, yeah, this is on, let's see, pairing. Oh, okay. This speaker's doing something.
It's a pair.
On in, okay. Try,
Maybe Bluetooth or something.
Yeah, right. But Bruce's laptop.
Are you trying, we're not hearing you yet.
I hadn't read them
Well, that's,
Oh, is that not?
is that, yeah, shall we, what is that?
I don't know.
Can we- Let's see. This is Mary Fulton's screen. Mary, I've got your screen and mic up here. Can you hear me? Can you hear us? Are you getting audio from us? They are, yes, they can hear us. So it's not coming in other way.
So did this speaker pair with your laptop?
I don't know.
Is that working?
Honestly, I don't
But
know
it said
what
it was
pairing
pairing.
to.
Our chair is not only a legislator, he's from MIT.
That's right.
Well, that doesn't mean I can fix this problem. I don't know. Can we get audio on here?
No, we aren't. I mean, that's, I mean, just on here.
Yeah.
So they're coming through here, yeah.
They might be able to, it's just, the only question is whether we down or not.
Karen, can you see the woman out there?
You mute her. Alright, can you all hear us now?
You're muted now.
Yeah, I mean, how,
Not very well.
now it's a little quiet. Okay.
It's like performance incentives. What you pay for.
Just turn it
As you know, stock markets are going bananas. And you would have with a Monday meeting.
Yeah.
I texted them before to say that the appendix can't be there. Let the members get your point of view without looking over your shoulder.
They're trying to get some.
Big issue. As long as we're solving
View your screen, right?
to
Yeah.
year-to-year sales. As long as Bedford continues and ignore the others shared incentive politics.
Right.
Oh, if you're doing this, let's hold the bottom left hand screen.
And they're just gonna do this. Come on, this one. That's what we're trying to do. Over here.
Yeah.
Right. Two property sites. Both making their part and communicating with each other. Yeah, there's exceptions.
Do we put that as Harry Road again?
Okay, is that James?
Oh, that's.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Right.
I'd rather. A hazard in terms of. Let's not complain. Once you're there, then set but as long as Benford's got one others, they're gonna scoot.
Hi, hey, all right, so they can hear us, we can't hear you. Do we know the dial?
I think so, there's a number on top of it.
So,
When you turn the volume.
There you go. I'm really good
He sent you a number to call in.
I did great.
You know, on this basis, so
Now you're muted.
Which report?
we're gonna zoom in.
Those children didn't have before. They started this year, right? This is the one you just. I mean, that's.
We're good.
is everybody? Thanks so much.
You're muted now. Turn off your mute.
That was good.
Very relatable. So why don't we just start with that? Start doing this, right?
All right, does everybody, can you guys hear us?
We can hear you good.
Okay, great.
We've got you, all right, I think we're back to business.
So, Joel, and Mary. We're back in, yes, I can hear you. Can you hear us?
Great.
Look forward to this. Send something up there that does this.
Yep, there we go. Okay, so we are not able to hear you, but thank you for having us. And then when we get to the question portion, I guess, are you able to type questions to you?
But if you
We
can,
can unmute at that point.
Roll on you there.
Okay,
Yeah.
here we go. All right, so thanks for being here with us. I guess I'm going to to turn it over to Mary Fulton, the senior policy analyst, so team to kind of start the background presentation.
Well, that's what I figured, that's the best.
Right.
They should be able to hear us.
Can you hear us? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So, good afternoon, from Heather Monroe and Board of Commission.
And there.
No, no,
Now,
Yes,
good.
Better?
Yes.
yes.
Okay. We are delighted to present to the Commission on school funding and look forward to your work over the coming months.
Yeah, I'm free.
I want to begin with a few remarks about Education Commission of the State, because many of you may not be familiar with our organization. We are a national, nonpartisan organization that serves as a member of any team in the state that is addressing education policy. We believe in the power of learning from experience, and we know informed policymakers create better education policy. We serve state policymakers through conducting general research, producing reports, convening policy and education leaders, and providing counsel. Our presentation today is an example of our counsel services that's also built on our research and report. Our presentation to the Commission is intended to provide a high-level overview of several school funding issues. We'll try to provide a national perspective on selected topics and also place New Hampshire within the national and a regional context with respect to school funding. If helpful, we would be happy to follow up with questions that are beyond the scope of today's overview, which will cover the following topics: expenditures and revenue for education, distributing state education funding, policy challenges, overcoming policy challenges, legislative trends, and funding for competency-based education. The first slide is a regional look at per pupil expenditures from all revenue sources for FY 2017 based on NCEF data, and that's the National Center for Education Statistics. New England states typically spend above the national average per pupil of $12,260. And New Hampshire is basically in line with the region at $16,000. Differences among states may be due to several factors, including cost of educated students and other school and district services. This next slide provides a regional look at revenue per pupil for FY 2017. As with expenditures, New England states tend to be above the national average of about $14,000 per pupil for revenue. New Hampshire, once again, is basically in line with the region at $17,320. To dive a little deeper, we summarized revenue per pupil by source for the region. The federal share is that top green bar. The local share is the middle orange bar. The state share is the bottom purple bar. You will notice that New Hampshire has the lowest state percentage share in the region at 32.2%. And Vermont is clearly an outlier with 3.9% local revenue. Vermont essentially uses a statewide education property tax and other revenue sources to fund education. So everything kind of rolls up to the state level and is redistributed to the local side.
That's true.
The national average for percentages of revenue sources is as follows. Federal, 8%, state is 47%, and local is 45%.
Can we ask questions as you go along?
Can we ask questions?
Sure.
They can hear us?
Yeah.
So on the state share in New Hampshire, does the state share include the statewide education property tax?
It does.
It's reported through NCDS, so if the NCDS data includes that, then yes.
Okay. I think it's the consensus around here that does include that.
Yeah. Yeah, because I think that's been kind of the understanding of the share, about a little about 30%.
Yeah.
Comes from the state side. Okay, so now, so, thank you, Elizabeth. What I do, kind of do a dual, advancement of the slides here. So this color-coded map shows the different state funding models, and we break out these models in the following slides. The categories are based on our 50-state comparison on K-12 funding, which is listed at the end of our presentation. The purple states are those that use foundation formulas. There's 36 states in District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. The orange states, 8 of them use a resource allocation model. The green are a hybrid model, and there's 4 states. And the gray are the exceptions, and there's 2 states, Vermont and Wisconsin. You may already know that school funding systems are complicated, and there are nuances in each state within the general model. And making sense of school finance is challenging, even for those who understand these issues, especially as states adopt minor to significant changes. 36 states, including New Hampshire and DC and Puerto Rico, use foundation formula. Under a foundation formula, districts receive a base amount of funding per student with additional money or weight added to meet the needs of different student populations, such as special education students. And I'll talk more about these cost adjustments later. Essentially, states of foundation formulas determine the foundation or base amount, account students with higher cost adjustments, multiply the student count by the foundation amount, determine the state versus local split, and then add on outside funding for facilities, transportation, and other expenses. The reasons for the widespread use of foundation formulas include they're easy to establish, the formula can be adjusted to meet state or district educational needs and economic circumstances. They provide districts with a greater autonomy in decision making. 8 states use a resource allocation model, and under this approach, states distribute resources rather than assign rates or dollar values based on certain criteria. States with these models typically fund a certain number of teaching and other positions for each district based on student enrollment. Payment for these positions can be determined by a statewide salary schedule or a flat dollar amount per position. In addition to staff positions, districts receive funding for other costs, including maintenance and operations, textbooks, and technology. 4 states, including Georgia, Maine, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, operate hybrid funding models. While it's difficult to categorize these approaches, the systems often combine foundation formulas, resource allocation models, and various cost factors. Vermont fall under the exception category, and I'll talk more about Vermont in a few minutes. We're going to dive a little deeper into a few states' funding systems. New Hampshire primarily operates a student-based funding formula, and your state assigns a cost to the education of a student with no special needs called a base amount. Then your state accounts for the additional cost of educating specific categories of students by adding flat dollar amounts to the base for each student in those categories and through program-based allocations such as career and technical education. The adjustment categories include free and reduced price lunch, English language learners, and special education. Since the Commission is interested in 2 regional states, I will briefly summarize funding systems in Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Vermont. In Massachusetts, the foundation budget for each school district is calculated based per pupil amount in different grade bands, such as elementary or high school, across several cost areas. Essentially, the base level is derived by multiplying the average per pupil allocation for various expense categories by the number of students in each of the grade bands. In New Jersey, the state uses primarily a student-based funding formula similar to New Hampshire. The state determines a base amount and then accounts for the cost of educating specific categories of students through program allocations and by adding multipliers to the base amount to generate additional funding for certain students. And once again, I will talk more about those adjustments in later slides. And then lastly, Vermont, they use a funding system that does not have a fixed funding amount set by the state. The districts have the ability to determine their own funding levels with some state restrictions, and then have the cost of that funding split between the district and the state. We've talked a bit about some of the policy challenges that states face with respect to school funding. First step is student and school attributes. State school finance systems typically account for differences in geographic factors and student demographics across districts. All states have differing numbers of rural and urban districts, wealthy and low-income districts, concentrations of English language learners, and special education students, etc. When designing school funding systems, states may allocate additional funding to account for the differences in cost and do so based on their own specific context. For example, districts with high concentrations of special student populations would likely require additional support to provide an education aligned with state standards. Yet, states face ongoing challenges to determine and fund the appropriate adjustments for different student populations and other factors, especially as the needs of students and education goals evolve. The next few slides summarize how New Hampshire, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Vermont allocate funds for student and school attributes. New Hampshire uses flat rates to provide additional funding for at-risk or free and reduced lunch eligibility, special education, and English language learners. And flat rates provide the same funding level for special student populations regardless of the degree of their need. New Hampshire also allocates additional funding for third grade students who score below proficient on the state reading assessment if that student is not counted in another category. We also summarize similar information for funding of student populations and school factors in Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Vermont. Like New Hampshire, all three states make adjustments for special education, at-risk, and English language learner students, and Vermont accounts for small and isolated schools. For some student populations, these states use a multiple grade system that allocates funds based on the severity of student conditions, for example, for special education needs. A consensus-based system provides additional funding based on the assumption that districts have the same percentage of special population students. Next policy challenge, adequacy and equity. Most state school finance systems attempt to accomplish two goals to provide an education for students: account for disparities in costs among schools and districts to achieve equal educational opportunities, the equity, and account for disparities in local school districts' ability to cover those costs for adequacy. While these are general descriptions for equitable and adequate education, states will approach these issues in different ways. There is no common definition or metric to assess equity and adequacy across states. This is largely due to differences in state constitutional obligations and how those obligations may be interpreted by state courts, as well as state context, priorities, and history of funding education. In developing funding formulas, legislatures have to navigate their state's unique circumstances related to disparities of wealth among the school districts. The state relies heavily on local funds. The ability for districts to support schools is often a function of their wealth. The next policy challenge is revenue. A state's fiscal context, economic conditions, constitutional obligations, policy and other factors influence the local, state, and federal share of school funding. Additionally, revenue streams may fluctuate over time. And revenue sources for education vary across the state. In 2015 and 16, according to NCEF, in 23 states, at least half of all revenue came from state government, while in 15 states and the District of Columbia, at least half of all revenue came from local government. In the remaining 12 states, no single revenue source made up more than half of all revenue. And several factors may influence the amount of revenue that comes from state or local support. A state's available revenue sources, a state's funding formula may require more state or local effort. Constitutional obligations or court decisions may require the state to provide adequate or equitable funding to less wealthy districts. And policymakers face the challenge of determining the right balance of revenue share between state and local support to fit their unique circumstances. And there are several revenue streams that support state aid for education, including income taxes, state property taxes, sales taxes, sin taxes, lottery funds, and taxes on natural resources. Importantly, changes in economic conditions can affect how much states can expect to receive from these revenue streams. For example, consumer spending directly influences sales tax revenue. And the last policy challenge is cost factors. There are many cost factors related to education funding, including school personnel, facilities, maintenance and operations, administration, transportation, instructional materials, and technology. Not all cost factors are accounted for in state aid for schools. States may have different funding systems or revenue streams for costs such as facilities or transportation. With few exceptions, however, personnel expenditures make up the largest part of a district's budget. States often address education funding issues through legislative action or voter initiatives and/or a state's response to litigation and court decisions. So this might sound like a familiar story. There is a general consensus in your state that the school funding system should be improved. The state creates a task force or a commission to discuss ways to change the funding formula. Some great ideas are placed on the table, and then only minor revisions are proposed or implemented, or perhaps nothing happens. Changing an education funding formula and or significantly increasing state funding is difficult and complicated work. In most states, there needs to be collaborative and commitment among a broad group of policymakers and other leaders, or perhaps pressure from the court to implement significant changes to funding systems. More commonly, it is incremental change that takes place through budget or legislation. Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and New Jersey all have formed at least one task force in recent years with varying degrees of impact on education funding systems. Voters may bring about change to education funding through a specific initiative. For example, California voters approved a significant funding increase for education several years ago. This gave the state the money to cushion the transition to a new funding formula. Without the voter mandate and additional funding, it would have been far more difficult to overhaul state funding systems. In 2018, Georgia voters approved Amendment 5 that allows school districts within a county to call for a referendum to levy a sales tax for education purposes. Also in 2018, Maryland and Michigan approved taxes on gambling and marijuana as a source of revenue for public schools. And now everyone's favorite, court mandate. Almost every state has encountered litigation challenging their education finance system. The outcomes of and state responses to these court cases vary depending on the state's context, constitutional obligations, and the court's interpretation. For example, the Campbell cases in Wyoming changed how funding is distributed in the state. Now, every school must offer the courses necessary to be accepted into the University of Wyoming, no matter how small or remote the school. Since 1973, only 3 states have not faced school funding court cases, as Hawaii, Nevada, and Utah. Perhaps that brings some comfort to those of you in New Hampshire. So I'm going to spend a little time on some recent legislative terms, and then we'll wrap it up with competency-based education. Like many previous years, there has been a high volume of K-12 finance bills introduced during the 2019 legislative session. Of the 30 states that proposed the 430 bills last year, 40 were enacted. Through legislation, states are addressing several education funding issues, in part due to strong budget conditions. States are making changes to revenue sources and/or the allocation of revenue to help address education needs. States also are looking for funding methods that more accurately distribute funding to high-need students. And states are restructuring how they allocate state aid for facilities and the process by which districts apply for state aid for these costs. So Iowa and Utah are examples of states that fund competency-based education instruction and professional development through grants or other funding sources. While there is interest in aligning funding with student outcomes, states have not yet supported competency-based education programs through their funding system. And emerging research is examining the reasons and options for funding, for performance funding. The Foundation for Excellence in Education, or Excel in Ed, is one of the leading organizations on performance funding and student-centered learning. Under performance funding approach, Excel in Ed suggests that a portion of funding would be allocated to schools based on how well the students are performing academically. School funding levels would be determined in part by using performance metrics, such as pass rates on state exams, high school graduation rates, or college attendance rates. And states could set performance standards, such as a minimum level of achievement, student growth, or partial success related to the metric. Funds could be drawn from base funding and new pools of funding, or a combination of the two. Funding sources for performance could be capped or uncapped. At this point, discussions about K-12 performance funding are mostly at the conceptual stage. That said, if more states express an interest in this approach, we may see some concrete steps for performance funding, even if at the margin.
Yeah, Ed.
On the performance funding, is that as an incentive for those who are underperforming, or a reward for those that are overperforming?
It could be either. This would be up to the state's discretion how you set up your competence or performance funding system. So right now, because basically no one is doing this, and there's just some materials and reports out there, suggested options. This is something that state could decide what to do, and that I mentioned some of the performance standards. You could reward student growth, for example. This goes back to the Child Left Behind and ESSA, where originally states were kind of moving for rewarding like ultimate growth, and that typically benefited some of the higher performing districts. Yet a lot of states then shifted to recognizing the growth that students were making in various subjects. So you can certainly incorporate those types of elements of components into a competency-based system.
So thanks, Mary. For members of the commission, if questions come up during this, please just jump in and do it, because I've got my face pointed this way too, in the slide. So please just hopefully that this conference table is encouraging participation. So, Mary, we'll keep going. Great, thanks.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's good because this is the last slide. In closing, I want to express our appreciation for the opportunity to present to the Commission. We hope that our presentation has provided a useful, high-level overview of school finance and some of the components of the state system. I also mentioned that we can state on a thin top layer of school funding, and then you quickly dive into the details and complexities of this issue that states face on a perennial basis. There are no easy or off-the-shelf answers to school funding, especially as issues evolve with the changing needs of students, schools, communities, and states. It is helpful to look at how other states construct the funding system and address various issues. However, each state's context is different. While the Education Commission in states may not be in a position to answer all of your school funding questions, we are here to serve as part of your education policy team as New Hampshire moves forward to examine your challenges, priorities, and options. Thank you.
Great, well, thank you very much, Mary, for the overview on this and for focusing, for putting some attention on some of our neighboring states as well in New Jersey, Massachusetts and Vermont. I've got a couple of questions that I'm sure members of the commission do too. When you had an earlier slide, you showed Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Vermont. And I think the New Jersey in the New Jersey block, you showed a foundation base of $11,775. That's the base. So the differential components would be on top of that.
Yes.
Okay.
So any of their, especially like this, they use kind of the multiple weight system, so they make adjustments for the severity of students' needs.
Okay. I'm not sure I understand that. What do they do with the weighting of that?
Right. So this, of course, is complicated because everything with school finance is complicated. So in New Hampshire, as I mentioned, you all use kind of a flat rate system.
Mm-hmm.
So for your special education students, no matter their disability, whether it's a severe physical disability or maybe a more mild cognitive disability, those students receive the same amount or the flat amount.
Right.
In New Jersey, yeah, and in New Jersey and other states, they'll adjust that rate so the students with a more severe physical disability will receive a higher rate or more funding versus students with a lesser degree of disability.
Okay. Does New Jersey do anything for proxy for poverty or depth of poverty in by district?
Yes, so they use what they call at risk. So that's the more common term for at risk students. I mean, you all kind of refer to it, I believe, as the free and reduced lunch eligibility. And we could certainly provide additional information on their exact weighting system for at risk. But it's also based on their free and reduced price lunch. They just have a different level of funding for that weight, and they may adjust it once again because they have a multiple weight system.
And then what do we have similar information about Massachusetts? What their foundation base is, and are they doing a flat differentiated, or are they doing a weighted type?
So they do the multiple weight system for at risk and English language learners, and then they use a consensus-based system at high cost for special education. So with special education, there's kind of some consensus that there's maybe 10 to 12% of students could be identified for special education. That's kind of a national figure. So they may kind of use that figure or whatever the kind of averages across the state have roughly the same percentage of special education students. Even if that's maybe not exactly true, that's kind of the assumption. And then I think they provide some additional costs for very, very high cost students. And once again, that's for special education, and they use the multiple rate system for at-risk and English language learners.
And then I've got one last question, and then I know there's a bunch more around here. In Vermont, I'm not quite sure I understood what they were doing. Am I the only one? All right.
You're not, including my colleagues. And so we can certainly provide more details, but basically it's kind of a locally driven estimate of their costs. And there's some state restrictions placed on that estimate. And then they kind of submit that information, I believe, to the state, and they kind of figure out the state and district share. And as we saw in the slide where we broke down the revenue by source and in the region, they were the ones that were at 3.9%.
Right.
Right. So, and once again, we'd be more than happy to provide some additional details about Vermont in a follow-up response.
Well, do you have a historical perspective on how Vermont ultimately achieved the statewide approach to this?
I don't know the answer to that question, to be quite honest. And this may be, as Dr. Mallory referred to the RFP and then the subsequent contract, that may be a good question to explore through that process, where you want to delve a little deeper into how other states are funding their education systems, especially with respect to equity and adequacy. We can see what we have available. There are some good sources that track the history, and there's probably more sources that kind of just look at the more recent changes and what the system looks like now. But we'll add that to our list. And once again, I think that might be something for within the scope of the RFP contract.
Thank you.
Bill, just jump in.
Come up there just to make sure.
Yeah, can you hear Bill from?
Hello.
All right, come on up.
Can you hear me? I'm torturing Bill.
Yes, we can hear.
Okay, my question relates to the degree to which these different states have their spending formulas differentiate between school districts, so that school districts with greater need get a higher grant per pupil than school districts that are viewed as better resourced. So in New Hampshire, for example, with just adequacy aid, a poorer town like Claremont would get, say, 30% of its total spending from the state aid formula, the adequacy formula. Whereas a more better resource town like Hampton, which is similarly sized, would get about 30%. The same percentage. But in Massachusetts, I understand the Chapter 70 result they've got now, a town like New Bedford, which is viewed as having less resources, would get 80% of their total spending from state aid, whereas Wellesley, viewed as a better resource town, would get 9% of their total spending from the state. Massachusetts seems to have a wider variation in the way they distribute aid among districts than New Hampshire. And I just wonder if you have data on showing the disparity that different states have, or if you could comment on the type of disparity among poorer and better resource towns. Thanks.
That is a very thoughtful question. And I don't believe I or some of my colleagues are in a position to answer that today. One needs to see if there's information available. And also, I think this may be within the scope of the contract with the RFP, where that individual or that group could dive into deeper analysis, do some data analysis on what's happening in all these different states and kind of go much deeper into some of their equity and adequacy and the property, taxes, to really get a much better picture of what's happening, because a lot of what we see is kind of at a higher level. And, it's possible it might make sense to kind of connect with some folks in states like Massachusetts to understand how that is really playing out across districts and those equity and advocacy issues. We'll see what we can add that question to our list as well. No guarantee of what we'll be able to find, but I think that's one that you might want to keep on your list for the contractors.
Thank you.
I want to get to Iris in a no. Mary, did we get some information from Massachusetts?
We did,
At the
actually,
district level though?
I don't know if it was on the, no, because it was the, app, and I shared that with Bruce. I sent
Okay,
it to him.
okay,
But
maybe
we
we want,
didn't get district by district.
okay, maybe we want to get that out there, so that might help to Bill's district by district question. So Iris, I'm sorry.
Yeah, following up on his question, I think it relates more to interpretation of our particular constitutional rulings by our particular courts than it does any kind of analysis of what's happened in other states. I mean, it's just not an approach that was on the table previously because of the way we've been led to believe we had to interpret our court rulings. So maybe we need to delve more into that rather than have any kind of data analysis to figure out where we might be able to go with that concept or not be able to go with
Sure.
that concept.
Sure, no, very good point. Please, anybody jump in with questions here while Mary.
Hi, has there been any analysis done with regard to the changes that states have made? Massachusetts, for example, they have started, their achievement levels have gone up so much since they've done their major school reform efforts. And I think New Jersey also has seen that too. I don't know about Vermont, but do you have any information like that?
So are you really talking about state, like student performance in some of these states, or some relationship to their funding systems, or more about some of the the school reforms or academic performance reforms that they've undertaken?
Well, basically, do the increases in funding that are provided result in higher academic achievement?
That also is a thoughtful and a very classic and question that
I know.
states and other folks that have been spinning around for years. We'll see what information we can find out. Sometimes it's hard to make those connections because there's so many factors that influence student performance, and also how some schools and districts may have spent some of those resources. We know the quality of teachers can matter, as well as leaders, and sometimes instructional materials or pedagogical practices. So sometimes it's difficult to understand the correlations and connections between increased funding and increased performance. So see if we can find some general studies on that. And once again, I can keep that on the list for your contractor.
Well, I just want to push that a little bit further because Massachusetts had a whole concerted effort that they did. And I think you'd have to look at the total effort that was made within the state toward enhancing education.
Right, yes, as I mentioned, we'll put it on a list.
Thank you.
I don't want to kind of draw any conclusions without looking a little deeper into some of the research on the course, but Massachusetts had a reputation as high performing for a long time. There's probably a few little leaks in there if you pull back the curtain, but they're a state that has, for years, been a high performer. Some of it might be related to their funding level, as well as some other components, so that they have some strong academic standards. I think they were one of the first states to kind of put in place some strong academic standards and relate them to their assessments, and this is back probably starting in the early 2000s.
So Mary, when you've seen or when you've worked with other states who are tackling their addressing their school funding problems or school funding matters, are states also simultaneously addressing standards?
That depends. I think it falls all over the continuum. I think some states sometimes they kind of, go hand in hand on the same track. And so, if, especially if the court has mentioned anything about the quality of education, as well as the funding level, they may be more inclined to do both based on a court decision. Yet most states, in my experience, are regularly reviewing what's happening in their schools, what's up in their districts and with the state education offices, and are they meeting the goals? Are they meeting the standards? Are they meeting the expectations that the state is sending? And so that has been an ongoing process, and over 20, 30, 40, 50 years or longer. And it may get tied up in the funding issues as well. And sometimes to achieve some of those higher standards, sometimes some additional funding is necessary.
Right, right. Yeah, because I think I think our commission is sort of at a place where we've been learning about various funding models and examining what other states are doing and what we've been doing and what our constitutional and case law court decisions have brought us, and looking at the charge of the commission, whether or not we're strictly about how much the state should be funding our public education, or whether that also extends to the standards or the definition of what goes into an adequate education based on those standards, and some comments around the meeting last week. I think there was some, I missed the meeting, but there was some very rich, robust discussion from what I could get from the video as to are we looking at outcomes for students as well as funding that goes into it, or are we looking at adequacy as defined by the state based on the standards that are defined by the state? So if our current adequacy funding doesn't include, and I'm just making an example, school nurses, yet the state requires a school nurse, then are we missing something from adequacy? It's not really expanding the standard, it's just making sure that that adequacy reflects the standard. So, I'm just sort of putting that out there for members of the commission. This is what I got out of watching last week's meeting, and wanted to sort of get your and Joel's thoughts as to when you're talking with other commissions in different states tackling this. Do they get to this point, and what do they do?
I may not have an answer to that. Some of it is some of it can be driven by the charge of a commission, and the decision by the commission members were that they, for example, if that charge is kind of narrowly defined, maybe it is about just revisiting that adequacy level and what's included in that whole bucket. And if the commission members decide to take, or if there's other reasons to stay within that kind of prescribed narrow charge, commission members or task force members may just adhere to that, kind of do their work, put forward some recommendations or a final report. Other commissions, they may have a broader charge that is not as defined.
Yeah, I would just mention Nevada has been going through the Nevada Ready program since I think 2017 or so, and it was part of a larger charge for updating the standards, bringing more technology into the classroom, and a workforce development angle, trying to meet the state's workforce needs. And it tied into a rewrite of their funding formula, which hadn't been, I think it was about 50 years since the last Nevada rewrite. And so I think depending on the charge of the commission, that I know that was a relatively large-scale program put in place by the superintendent there. So it kind of had a large degree of buy-in from the business community and the legislature and the commission. But so some places do have that large-scale sort of look at the entire system.
And some of it might be what leeway you all determine that you have within your charge. We can't answer that question.
else have any?
So, is there a hand down?
Yeah, Jim.
Thank you. I wanted to focus on ruralness as a measure. You indicated that New Hampshire, for instance, doesn't adjust for small or isolated schools. And Joel, you were helpful in directing us to some of the previous ECS studies, one of which was on rural schools. And as I recall, there's something like 30, while our subset of states that we asked you about didn't have those indicators, like New Hampshire doesn't. As I recall, that report said about 30 states had different weights. And I recall in that study that it said that they distinguished by the number of square miles in a district, and that that differentiation could impact not just transportation charges, but also administration and costs for facilities. All of which makes sense, except we've kind of fought against that and by saying, gee, we just have too many, as opposed to sort of embracing our local option of, well, if you've got certain physical characteristics, maybe we should embrace it. My point there is trying to get a sense, I couldn't from your report, to what extent does that factor into some of those state formulas?
So I'm trying to clarify, understand your question. So it sounds like you have information on which states make adjustments for like small and isolated, or however states define that. So are you asking like what were the implications for the funding formula, or I apologize.
Yes, it is that, because the report just said yes or no, check the box. As opposed to, and so now that you have the information, and so what do you do with it? I mean, just one of the problems is the ability to gather it, and then the second is, once you gather it, what do you do with it?
No, I think that's a third question. So, one, because I think I know the report you're referring to. So, one, it might be helpful to maybe see some state examples with a little more detail about their adjustments for rural and isolated.
Great. Yeah.
Yeah. So we could start there. It could be, especially it might make more sense to look at states that are more like New Hampshire than states that are more like Colorado. Perhaps. We're one of those large rectangular states. I'm not sure how many New Hampshires could fit in our state, but that brings some different issues when you have districts that are, they're maybe as large as your entire state. Certainly with transportation and some of the administrative costs and the cost of providing particular education instruction. So we could maybe look at some states that have that adjustment pay per month. And if we could provide a little bit more information about that. Not sure if we could dig up like, the implications of that, but we could at least look at how states are adjusting for that rural and isolated situation.
And Eric's going to know that I think we might have a previous information request for another state that we can update with some, maybe from your state for you guys, and get back with you guys with a little more detailed information on that.
So I had a question on Vermont, which is peculiar compared to the other states. Do they have any sort of limitation on what each individual school district can submit as a budget? Because if they're picking up 90% of the cost of each district, and you've got one district that says, we need 12 tennis courts and 3 swimming pools, and another district says, no, we don't do that stuff. How do they reconcile that sort of the lack of local control to raise money and just allow people to throw budgets in, and then how do they get people to say, okay, well, you guys can do what you want, we're willing to contribute through our taxes to do whatever anyone wants to do. I would think in a place like New Hampshire where there's a lot of local control and there's all this resentment from donor districts and whatever, it'd be hard for us to reconcile that difference if we went to something as extensive as paying for the bulk of the state's education.
Yes, that would be a significant change for your state, and I think Vermont in general is kind of an outlier on that front anyway. There are some state restrictions, we're gonna add that for our list as well, so we can better understand, because you're right, that would seem perhaps out of across the line to ask for all those amenities and then have the state pay for them. So we'll delve a little deeper into the Vermont funding system and try to identify the state restrictions that probably keep that at a more reasonable level and a more reasonable request.
Great. Any other questions for Joel or Mary while we're here? Bruce?
This has been a really helpful initial overview. Obviously, any good graduate seminar, you raise more questions than you answer, so you've done a good job in that sense.
Can we get a copy of the slide deck to put on?
Yes. Yeah, we'll post that. We will also provide links, as I mentioned, our own website will be going up this week. We'll have links to all of the relevant ECS reports that were just referenced today, as well as others. I'll follow up with Joel and Mary and get some of those questions answered back as well. So this is the beginning of the process.
That sounds great. We'll work on our end to answer the questions that we've been given today and get those back to you in a relatively timely fashion.
Yeah. All right, thank you once again, and we wish you the best moving forward.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Joel. Thanks, Mary.
Thank you.
Take care.
Chairman?
Yes. Yep. Just jump in.
No, statewide property taxes, I have one more question I'd like to feed to them. We're not alone. I think there are numbers that, I think where we might be alone is that we don't collect it at the state. Our ERA doesn't collect it. I think if they can document that for us, that would be.
Actually, John, do you know the answer to that? That's a good question.
Vermont has a mix of local and state administration of their property tax.
Say that again?
Vermont, I believe, has a mix of local and state. It's not exactly like ours, but I don't know about the others.
One of the things that I was surprised as I looked at 4 states have state funding at 38%. And we're at 32%. I had expected it to be higher at other states, right?
Yes, but I think we're at 22%.
No.
They're
Because their data's wrong. And I don't know if it's wrong for other states. I'm just saying that 10% of that is smart.
So we need to make sure that we're doing apples to apples though on
Yes.
that. So, yeah.
That's the fair point, is that how you characterize the statewide property tax is important, but as a matter of their data, because that's the way financial accounting and the way the credit markets calculate it, those are all treated as state dollars, because they're legally state enforced. If people fail to pay it, the state would enforce against it, so those are treated as state dollars. Then, if you include that, it's 32%. If you don't include it, it's your number, that's right.
I get it, but Jay Kahn, taxpayer, doesn't feel like it's 32%.
So Jay, would it be good then to maybe get a breakdown, whether it's just New England states or all the states, that we look at from, state revenues outside of, derived from local property taxes, then statewide education property taxes, and then everything else that's heaped on there. That way we can really sort of compare these,
Yes, that would be very helpful.
funding sources, so.
Can I ask with Mel, your comment is intriguing. Why were you under the impression that other New England states, not like Nebraska, because that's right, that they were higher as a state percentage share of total spending than New Hampshire.
I just did.
And they are
I
higher.
never had a chance to look at what other states are providing is one thing. And I just had assumed that there was more state tax going back to local learning. So that was a stunning slide for me as I looked.
Understood.
And Jay now goes in a whole, another curveball
Right,
here
yeah.
as it relates to what is the actual state obligation vis-a-vis that of what you get from SWEP.
Right.
Because as you say, SWEP is a statewide tax. It's not necessarily coming out of it's a different kind of a funding source than just coming out of
Yes.
what we take out of the general fund, so to speak.
But
So
Senator Khan,
this was a stunning thing to me.
according to your logic though, Vermont would go from a top state funder to a bottom state funder. Because you're saying anything that's property tax ought not be attributed to the state.
Yeah, and so I guess we'll need to determine how we define
Right.
some of these terms, because
Exactly.
were SWEPs a part of a state pool of dollars,
Yes.
that would categorize it one way for me. And if it merely is collected locally to be retained locally, then it's not really contributing to, state distribution formulas. So, at any rate, I think getting at some of the who's like us, and if we really stand out as unique, then we deserve an asterisk.
I would say it's both.
It all comes from the
And
taxpayer.
but for, what is it, 20 million plus or minus that is retained
30.
It's 30.
30, so as to
29.
avoid uncomfortable political conversations for some state leaders. And by the way, I have some ideas that could help address that 30 million, put it back in our collective pockets. Yeah.
Yes, so,
You got,
Yeah, no,
but the other thing that came out of last week's conversation that was illuminating is the $6.60 that SWEP began at,
Right.
and the $1.90 that it's currently at in order to raise it.
you got it.
So, again, I think just how unique are we in our treatment of that? And if we are, then that's something to understand. If we're not, then it's the rate. It becomes a rate question as opposed to the collection question.
Has SWIFT ever been challenged by the courts?
I think at the Superior Court level, Bill,
Isn't it
that's
part
what I
of last
recall.
year?
And it's highly questionable, there's $30 million retention. And I believe a Superior Court judge said something.
Indeed, the Supreme Court faced it earlier on, so
Earlier on,
post
right.
the ABC plan in 2000, there were a number of challenges, but that plan really had a lot. That was a 660 with a big, piece of property tax that you collect and you keep locally. And there were even exemptions that were special, and that actually went right up to the Supreme Court and ruled unconstitutional.
What was
Yeah, that's right.
what was the result of that?
It was slightly different. It said it was this court, as I remember it in summary, I don't remember the name of it, but the message was, look, if you're gonna impose a state tax at a uniform rate, that you're undermining that. If what you do is, here's the state tax, here's the uniform rate, and oh, by the way, you don't have to enforce against the taxpayer the rate to the extent that it, becomes the excess.
Right.
That's the way it
Okay.
had it come up. So it's a little bit different than your question, but it has been right through it, that structure.
Iris,
I think the discussion of revenue is really interesting, but it's really not in our charge.
It is.
Let me take that as a chance to bring us to a kind of discussion I did want to be sure we got into this afternoon. And in fact, I want to start with the charge back to the commission, because they made the point that each of these commissions makes an interpretation of the language that's in its charge and decides for itself kind of stretch that interpretation and stretch that charge. So what I'm gonna do is reground this back in our design thinking process. We are in this first phase of that, of understanding the problem, and last week's discussion and today absolutely is getting us, we're peeling back the layers of the onion here. To use another metaphor, you'll get to know me, I use too many metaphors, but we are standing in front of a huge feast of information and possibilities and questions. And we're gonna nibble away at different parts of that feast for a while. And as we do, we're gonna decide which parts to come back to and have seconds on, or thirds, or fourths. And so, back to our favorite term, the word iterative. This is gonna be an iterative process. What's the problem we're trying to address? We're gonna get into that and just continue to, you all have given great input on that. And the document that you have in front of you is the sort of final summary of that. What would a successful solution look like? What's caused the problem? Prior efforts, with the reviews that you've been doing of prior legislative committees and the statutory requirements that you looked at prior to today's meeting as part of your homework, my students. We're all getting on the same page about this part of what the problem is and what are the assumptions about the problem that we hold both individually and collectively as a group. But back to the charge that is in the statute that created the commission. The very first one is to identify trends and disparities across the state in student performance. So there's an output measure clearly articulated in the charge to you. So this question about, are we only looking at inputs, are we also looking at outputs? I think absolutely we're doing both. The next charge is to reestablish the baseline for costs, programs, staffing, and facilities. That's the input side of the equation, right? And reestablishing that baseline, I think implicitly, my interpretation, requires us to re-look at the definition of adequacy. Because that, you can't have a baseline without a definition of adequacy that then drives the conversation, drives the analysis that we're doing. So that, I just wanted to, those are my thoughts about what our charge is, and that, those thoughts reflect what you all have produced so far. So if you look at the design, the three-page design thinking process handout that's in front of you for today, what's the problem we're trying to address? So last week, we did identify these 5 themes that came out of the earlier input, the writing that you all have done and shared with us. And I've now tried to boil that down, back to another metaphor, maple syrup season. Took 40 gallons of your input, made 1 gallon of syrup out of it. So the definition of adequacy rests on these key questions. What does it mean? What does cherish mean in the Constitution, in the context of the Constitution? And what are the components of an adequate education? So you have statutory language that describes the skills that we expect our students to learn in receiving adequate education, and the content, science and literacy and world knowledge and computer literacy and so on. We'll reference that in a second. So I think that's, we now have some guardrails and some guidance about the work that needs to be done going forward. In terms of equity and disparity, as a significant concern that you all have, it seems to me these questions here, again, capture what it is you're interested in. How do we equalize opportunity and reduce gaps in both opportunities and outcomes, regardless of what a kid's zip code is, to use shorthand. The revenue side, we recognize there's some political realities we're going to operate within, and I think that there was a desire by the commission to go ahead and begin to understand that we shouldn't arrive next fall with a set of solutions that don't reflect the political realities and culture of our state. So we're looking at what's the right mix of revenue types to assure sustainable funding. So this notion of a sustainable solution that uses the right mix of revenue types that also respect local property tax payers, especially those in property poor communities. That's a big one right there. That's very complex.
So Iris, this is what you were just talking about.
Yeah, and I got a lot of pushback, so I'd like to understand where it is in the chart.
Looking at revenue?
That we should come up with a recommended mix of revenue.
Can I answer that?
4A, the commission shall review education funding formula to ensure uniform and equitable design for financing the cost.
The design of the funding formula.
Financing the cost.
For financing the cost.
Again, it's your interpretation,
Yeah.
but that's,
I
have to ask the
That's
question.
fine if you wanna go there.
Okay.
I would say if that wasn't included, why are we here?
Well, great.
Well, can I understand that? So we saw handed out the 2001 tax blue ribbon study commission. The charge for there was clear, it was examine all of the revenue sources and evaluate which one would be possible for using in an education funding solution as a whole. So
Which one or which one?
which ones? It looked at all of them, and their charge wasn't about the formula for distributing aid or for the definition of adequacy. Their charge was really on, look at the value-added tax, look at income tax, look at property tax, and compare them all in a matrix and make some recommendations.
Where could the money come from, what the pros and cons?
So that was also had a significant budget. They had a great staff, Mr. Tannenwald, Dr. Tannenwald, and it took a long time, well longer than our commission has available to it by current time. So is that what you mean in the charge, that this charge is being viewed as broad enough to have us conduct a tax policy discussion, like what's better, the property tax or the sales tax? Because I think with Ira's, what
That's
she's
how I
saying,
read it.
I wonder, I don't get the sense of it the same way I did with the 2000 legislation authorizing the other commission. So the only reason I raised it is because it is so huge. Dave used the thing about there's a big ocean, of issues out there. If that's part of it, we're not even creating an RFP designed to get to the right people because none of the people we're RFPing have any tax policy expertise. They're all on the ed finance side. So I just wanted to raise that. We're getting to the point where we've got to make some important decisions to focus resources. And if we don't, we could skitter quite a bit.
So a couple things on that, Bill. I mean, I think the work of this commission could, if it wanted to, strictly be limited to the defining the cost of an adequate education and some sort of distribution model of state money to districts, whether it's based on, I'm just making it up, need, performance, whatever you want to, whatever metrics you want to define. But I think ultimately, what's going to be most useful to the legislature is probably some combination of that, as well as where could the money come from? Absent the where could the money come from, then we just be leaving it up to the legislature to do it, and they're going to have to. Ultimately, that's where it's going to be anyway. The most important work that this commission does is the costing out an adequate education and a distribution model for equitable, equitable funding. But I think we can certainly, be addressing the part of the charge that John, does, which is a design for financing the cost.
Yeah.
I think that's-
So without
Yeah.
going,
That's not-
without going as far as the other study, which did all modeling, it does seem to me that we can at least get to principles. I mean, if we're gonna do all this engagement work, a great deal of the money is going into community engagement work and hearings. That's what we're gonna hear about.
Yeah.
So, there's gonna be an earful about
Right,
revenue
right.
sources. So we will certainly have that information to do something with and to at least get halfway there toward the principles that should govern the choice of revenue.
Right, and that's what we're all gonna be hearing about over the next 2 weeks when
That's
we
right.
go to our school district meetings. You know, I don't, and again, this is just speaking for me, you know, in front of 500 Hopkinton taxpayers, we get a lot of people that show up at school district meetings, don't even need a teacher's contract on the, you know, on the warrant for that. But people by and large are not complaining about outcomes, they're complaining about my property taxes. So it's all about the revenue side. So, I mean, that I think is the urgency that started with House Bill 551 and ultimately wound up in the budget and it wound up with all of us around this table. You know, and I think we had some great discussion last week, particularly about outcomes, but that's not the urgency that's driving this commission right now.
2 points. One is, Bruce, in one of your emails, I don't know how many people got it, but you'd suggested maybe there are some subgroups
Yes.
to this committee.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think this conversation is lending itself to at least one of those.
I just said that.
The second is, or at least two, because there's the adequate education side, the definition, and then there's this revenue side definition to the extent that we tackle it. But I gotta point out B, what I read into B, because the last words there are determine, you know, every cost item with the revenue source that's uniform across the state, and it's the lack of uniformity across the state that, you know, put us here. So, you know, I think without saying, you know, determine which tax you prefer, I think revenue is inescapable from our charter.
Yeah, I just want to second that. I think it's undoubted to me that we have to address the revenue source, and it's in this charge, and we wouldn't be doing the job that's expected of us if we didn't address that.
Right.
We absolutely have to address the question of adequacy, what it means. We have to cost it out. We have to look at the revenue source, and we have to do the best job we can within the time frame we have. If time constraints are such that we can't dig as deeply as that group in 2001, so be it. But we can go pretty far, and we've got to look at SWEP, for example. Your question about what are the other states doing and how do they define SWEP, and is it administered at state level or local? All these good questions. That's part of the revenue discussion and examination we need to go into. So, you know, I'm here because not only do I care about education, but I care about how it's funded. And we've got to figure that out as best we can.
So if I could,
And then I just want to add one, I'm sorry, I want to pick up on another point, and I know you're going to get to the subgroups, yeah.
We're
We
getting
need,
kids
we
right.
need, we need to
Some agenda.
specialize.
Some
some-
agenda.
Good.
On the agenda.
So, just, we're still at the definition of the adequacy question right now. We will get absolutely to we'll call it the revenue side, but right now, what we've done is try to figure out what do we mean by adequacy and what is the definition of our overall problem that we're facing. So, funding formula and distribution, referencing concentrated student poverty, and how to assure that most needy districts receive the funds necessary to supplement local resources. How do you get to adequacy given the mix of kinds of communities and students that we have in New Hampshire? And then finally, student
Bruce,
outcomes and
Bruce, on
achievement.
that one, could you clarify for me how 4 is different from 2?
These are the themes that came up in the homework that you all given. These absolutely overlap. I'm not going to defend that they're distinct. Perhaps they're one and the same. But I think that the overall theme of equity and disparity is distinct from the overall theme of funding formula and distribution. Partly, we've mentioned this before, there are inequities in the funding formula. There are inequities in what happens to kids in schools. So we have student inequities and we have structural inequities. I guess I'm trying to preserve that distinction.
Thank you.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it was interesting when we had the ECS folks on the line, and they talked about Wyoming. And I wrote down the note that all schools must offer courses so that you could get admitted to the state college.
Yeah,
And I'm like, that's an interesting standard, because here in New Hampshire, I know if you go to Hopkinton, you'll get admitted to, the courses are offered that you can get admitted to UNH. But you don't have to drive too far from Hopkinton where those courses are not offered on campus. And I do college interviews for kids applying to college. And a lot of them have said, we've had to take classes at community college, at Upper Valley, to get what we needed to apply to college. So for sure, New Hampshire's standard does not live up to Wyoming's standard as far as providing an opportunity for an adequate education for everybody.
So around this definition of the problem, at the bottom of that first page, we have this, what I call an emerging hazard model. This is way oversimplified, but this is, again, what I gleaned from last week's discussion. First, we define adequacy. Then we understand what's the full cost of achieving this definition of adequacy. How do the resources then get distributed equitably? And the word equitable is, of course, a loaded term and complicated. And then where do the appropriations come from to support that distribution? And then finally, what are the accountability mechanisms with feedback loops to be sure the money has been spent in an effective way as intended by the legislature? There's probably also, and we'll get into this over the coming weeks, kind of a logic model around the revenue side of this as well. And we aren't there yet, but I anticipate us getting there. So sticking with adequacy for a minute, then, if you go to the second page on this handout, I've tried to identify what are the guiding assumptions now that seem to be behind our conversations. And again, the input from the stakeholders last Thursday as well. The definitions of adequacy must reflect the state standards, both funded and unfunded state and federal requirements, mandates, as well as the economic needs of the state of New Hampshire. So again, I'm trying to bring together threads of conversations here and again from our stakeholder meeting on Thursday. An adequate education takes into account both inputs around opportunity and the results around equity of outcomes. Not equality, but equity. And finally, adequacy refers to what actually happens to students. And funding for the provision of an adequate education is a fiscal matter separate from the definition of adequacy and the delivery of an adequate education, right? So, I mean, they're obviously interrelated, interdependent, but we want to be sure to keep in mind that they're two separate challenges, which brings us to the working structure in just a minute. And then the rest of this document is simply what you all know. It's the statutory definitions of adequacy, both skills and content. Those are current, so up through wherever the most recent amendments have been reflected here in that language as well. And so then the questions back to you are, sticking with adequacy, is there anything about this statutory language that needs to review or modification? Is there anything that could be deleted? Anything that's outdated here? It's always nice to take stuff out when you're doing this kind of process, and it's always very difficult. And then what's essential to leave just as it is, at least for now. We don't have probably the time today to delve into that very deeply, but I think I will come back to that in 1 second. Let me go ahead to this matter of back to the agenda today. Same questions I just answered. What's the statutory definition? Are the components of that definition that should be modified, added, or eliminated? And then I'll credit Dick Ames here for this last question on the agenda under adequacy. One approach would be to create some scenarios that reflect a continuum of adequacy, from, in Dick's words, least inclusive to most inclusive. So think about the airlines these days. Basic economy might, it'll get you a seat somewhere on the plane that you actually have to pay for to even get, a seat choice. And then there's extra legroom and so on. So what are we trying to achieve here in terms of our definition of adequacy that's appropriate to New Hampshire circumstances? New Hampshire resources and so on, least inclusive to most inclusive. And what we're proposing today, and Dave and I had a chance to talk about this, is that we begin to specialize in terms of your work on the commission. And I'm proposing, for your response and changes, that we work in 3 work groups. One focused on defining and costing adequacy. One on fiscal policy, what are the sources of funding for our public schools, and how should that money be distributed? And then finally, a group that is focused on engagement. That really, it works with us at CARC when we are out in public, in focus groups with stakeholders, in the conversations around the state with the general public. It helps shape what the questions are that we ask those folks to respond to, and helps us interpret the feedback that we get that comes back in. We, Carrie, Jordan, and I, will support each of those 3 subgroups. Obviously, when we have an external vendor, that vendor will be available to answer questions around defining and costing adequacy and questions around fiscal policy, although we take to heart Bill and others' comments that we're contracting with education funding and adequacy experts, not tax policy experts or fiscal policy experts per se. But in any case, we'll be able to pose questions to that organization once we have them nailed down as well. And the last thing I'll say about this working structure is that if we begin to work in these kind of work groups, we could go to every other week schedule for the full commission and have the work groups then meet in the off weeks, either virtually through Zoom links that we would support, or face-to-face, depending on where you're located and who you are. But Zoom works pretty well for that kind of meeting as well. And we would, again, of course, be recording those meetings, making available the videos or audio recordings of those meetings, and they become part of the records, the documents that we develop as well. So maybe I'll stop there and get your input on a working structure and maybe ways to modify that.
Thoughts on that, Iris?
Yeah, I understand why you wanna go to some kind of subcommittee structure. It does seem like fiscal policy has 2 pieces to it. You've got your revenue piece and your funding distribution formula. They're each incredibly huge tasks. It's a little difficult to begin to discuss a distribution formula when you haven't yet costed it.
Right.
So I think that it's a little difficult to have those things going on simultaneously as opposed to sequentially.
Could the fiscal policy group begin, though, to just focus on sources, and for example, go back to
Or
the
could it be
question.
a different group, separate group, so that those who are interested in the revenue piece, not necessarily the distribution part of it, don't have to
Sure.
necessarily work on it.
I would suggest distribution is more appropriately bucketed with defining and costing adequacy.
I agree.
Because that's how you
I agree.
that's the distribution.
I think that's a good
Keep
point,
going.
yeah.
On that one, and Iris mentioned it earlier, there is the concept of defining adequacy, costing it, figuring out what that total fund is for adequacy statewide, and then distributing it. Now, Iris expressed pretty clearly that she thinks that there's not much of a debate over how you distribute that it's gotta be distributed.
I don't think that's.
Okay, so that, what I care about is that whatever the state resources are that are made available for distribution among school districts, that formula is gonna look more like Massachusetts and drive aid to the most needy communities and not drive aid to the better resource communities. That's what I care about as a member of the commission. I have done tax policy in Washington, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire till I'm blue in the face. I don't care to do it again. That's not my issue. But a distribution formula that helps Claremont, which is the actual source of the Claremont lawsuits, is what I'm focused on. And so the question is, if I get on a distribution committee, which I'd like to do, I want to you know, I don't wanna, you said that, no, you can't, you gotta do it per pupil, cause some extra legislative source like the court said, you gotta distribute the same amount per pupil to every community and district.
I think that's to be determined by the committee.
Good, then, as long as that's it, that's the committee I would like to be on, so however we do that. And I like that, what John said, so I support and that defining cost of adequacy and the distribution, because I think adequacy is different depending on the community. And so I think the court is supportive.
And you know, I wanna jump on that really quickly too, because, you know, we've kicked around this figure quite a bit, that I think statewide, through all revenue sources, it's what, $3.2 billion a
Yes.
year for K-12?
Exactly.
And you know, I would suspect that given a more equitable distribution model, that number would go up, because it would go up some, because there's clearly some districts in the state that just are not able to raise sufficient funds locally to make up for what they would otherwise feel is necessary to do. So hopefully the result of what we do doesn't put communities in that, you know, school districts in that position, and that school districts will actually be spending the money that they need to do to meet the needs of their students and provide an opportunity for an adequate education. There's certainly going to be some districts that are going to spend well beyond that. And I mean, we've got districts in the state that spend 3 times what other districts on a per pupil basis. You know, they're outliers.
Yeah.
You know, and they may continue to do that despite your efforts to, you know, they're going to continue to do whatever they want to, what those districts want to do, but they're outliers. We're not designing it for.
Oh, and don't get me wrong, I have nothing against a district that wants to raise more money and spend it, fine. But the state aid
Right.
should be focused first on trying to eliminate those disparities.
Yep.
And then communities can do it, but not help everyone, you know, regardless of need with that precious state aid. That's my own, I'm ahead of it, but I wanna get on that.
So I got your name down.
Get rid of
Let me
that.
see, I'm gonna then revise this. It sounds to me like we have a defining, costing, and distributing group. And then I still think there's probably a fiscal policies revenue source group. Now, maybe that group isn't ready yet to get launched. And there's an engagement group, which is ready to be launched, because we're gonna start our focus groups with stakeholders this spring and with students as well. But what I'm proposing then is let me write a couple of sentences about what I see the sort of charge or scope of each of those 3 working groups, send that back out to you, and then you send us your preference for which committees, which working group you want to be. Just one.
Yeah, but I
So,
do
try
think, once you do that, it would be important for the whole committee to have a discussion
Yes.
of each of those
Oh, yes.
issues
Oh, yeah.
before the subcommittee starts.
Good.
Oh, sure.
You know,
Agreed.
just to make
Makes a
sure
lot
we've
of
got,
sense.
We're
That's
very
good.
clear on what we're doing.
Agreed.
yes,
Good. Good. Good.
Yeah, and I would also put it out there too, that even the fiscal policy, you know, committee looking at revenue sources, while you're right, you can't come up to any sort of like, you know, finished or recommendation without knowing what is coming out of the adequacy and distribution model. But it might be interesting to model some different,
It gets back to what I was saying, what Bruce picked up from material I gave him, scenarios.
yeah.
yes.
We don't know where we're at yet. Is it a lot more, or are we doing just fine? Or in between? Let's
And some of the questions
yeah,
that
look at
came up
those
with
scenarios.
ECS will inform that as well. So
Yeah.
I think that group can begin to look at, at other states, how to do multiple weighting and questions like that.
You could check that. I may respond to just one point that I think Bill made earlier. It's getting the money to the right place, to Claremont, not to the town. that's driven, in my opinion, and can be done within our constitutional constraints by what the cost of adequacy is. And back when you led the commission in 2008 to 9, you gave significant weight to the free and reduced price lunch kits. And it was more than a per pupil thing. It was concentration
Yeah.
of kids. So the base amount was less, so let's say 3,500. If the school or school district, there was ambiguity there, I
That's the other
know,
difference.
that's very key,
That's
very key.
Right.
But there was confusion later on legislatively.
Yeah.
If the school was above 50% concentration, then it would get another twice the base, big time. And it was based on the school population rather than the individual number of students. So it was a huge leap in money for those impacted school districts. So that can be worked on by this committee. There's a lot of room to go towards equity using the concept of adequacy.
I'd like to follow on both of their points. We had on our agenda last time, and it got deferred to today, and it's not happening today either, to take a look. You asked us to read the 08 report,
Right.
and that's one of the lessons. I mean, the lessons are basically all the things that have been deleted.
That's true.
Poverty,
That's
the
true.
special ed, and by resource,
By placement.
by
Oh, by
placement,
placement.
right?
You got it.
The disparity aid.
Right.
There's 2 or 3 other things that have all been deleted.
Yeah.
So he wants us to look like Massachusetts. I'd like to go back and see what we would have looked like if those things hadn't been taken out,
Agreed.
and which of them we might want to look at.
Right,
That's
no, it's very good,
Yeah.
that's very good.
But there's still a lot of factors we need to figure in, like building aid and.
I understand, at that time there was.
Immediate family and
That's right.
I'm
academic
also
achievement.
needs an update, and that was put in here also, every 10 years we were supposed to review
Right.
that.
That's correct.
So 10 years have gone
Have
by,
gone by,
and here
right.
we
Here we
are,
are.
it's time to do that.
So
But nonetheless, let's not think that we don't have something to learn.
We
from-
don't have to throw it out because
Agreed.
we can build on it.
good foundations.
But I would also like, before that committee gets started,
Okay, yes, yeah.
before that committee gets started, I'd like to have us have a discussion, just to say, about the point that Bill's raising. Because that's a huge departure from where the legislature thought it was allowed to go. We're allowed to target aid differentially within adequacy. That changes the whole thing. Well, you think you've had some legal knowledge.
So do I.
think you
I
can.
join Attorney
I want to
Ames.
hear a greater variety of viewpoints about whether that's
So-
possible.
So a couple things, we are currently doing that.
No, we're doing it outside of that.
No, I know we're doing it outside of adequacy, but so that's a way to do it. So you don't factor it into base adequacy, and
That's not what he's after.
just saying we're doing it right
Obnoxious.
outside of base adequacy.
Yes.
And it's very meaningful to a lot of districts. So what, and also, I think most of us were there when we heard from the Attorney General. And I think there were some very good points there. I think we can talk about that at another time, but the Attorney General was not warning us that don't cross this line because then you're gonna be beyond constitutional grounds. There was no such implication made on that. So let's do what we think we need to do to get it right. So far I have not seen any or heard anybody from the Attorney General's office or court say that don't come close to this because then you'll go too far.
I just quickly, I wanna say, we have a budget process too, we're gonna be coming into a budget year next year. I'm here mostly because I'm on the finance committee, so we need to start thinking about what are some changes in legislation. And I know that's down the road, but remember, we have a 2-year process, so every minute that we don't make decisions about things puts the final outcome out that much further. So we're coming right back into that, in January, 21. So, we need to have that in our minds.
Yeah.
Yeah, Bill.
One more, following on Iris's very nice, kind comments about this, is I wanna say, in my view, this commission is independent. We are not the legislature, so we don't have to make judgments necessarily. We can judge what is really the right answer in our view, what is a good answer policy-wise. The legislature may have reasons why it doesn't go the whole hog. That happened in Massachusetts, their commission. In addition, looking at Representative Ames with his kind comments, we can decide what we think is the right answer. There may be, down the line, a court who might disagree with what, but our job is to set up, if we can do it as a group, with kind of Rawlsian veil of ignorance, a justice blinder. We wanna say, what is the best answer? And then see what we can do. And the legislature may not really say that that's realistic in some respects, but if we do it well, I wouldn't be constrained out of the gate against the right answer.
You're right, you're absolutely right. So with that, Bruce is gonna send us some stuff to all of us on work groups and we can respond to that. Before we adjourn the meeting, I'd like to invite any members of the public who are with us this afternoon to share with us any thoughts or comments they have, either something you heard today or something you want to bring to us because it's important to us. Gotta be excited, it's that season, it's that time of year. Did I see, is there a hand? Could you join us right down here?
Hello, my name's Jane Farini. I'm an assistant city attorney with the city of Portsmouth. I had a question about the SWEPT, and the Conville case did raise the constitutionality of SWEPT. However, the court decided that because the formula was unconstitutional, it was not right at this time to analyze the constitutionality of SWEPT. But certainly, my reading of it, and I'm sure several attorneys nodding their heads, that would be an issue that could be taken up once a new formula was established. Just for clarification, I track this on behalf of Portsmouth, which is a donor town, and but I do track the condo litigation as part of that task. And obviously, the folks will become aware of the briefs that are filed and ultimately the decision. But I just wanted to clarify that was raised, that it is unripe at this time, but once a new formula comes, that the court left that door very wide open in my opinion. I just wanted to share that.
Thanks very much.
Yep.
I'd like to just make a note on the reference to the Condell case.
Yep.
For the benefit of everyone. The state has filed its brief, and if you're interested in seeing one side of the argument, it's on file, and maybe it could be unearthed.
Yeah, we can pop that up. Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks, Dave. Anything else while we're here? Anything else from members of the commission for the good of the cause? Yes, Jim.
Can I just clarify, because I know Bruce and his team are gonna be fleshing these ideas out a little bit more. When I think about the financing system, I think less about should we have an income tax, should we increase business taxes? I think more about the property taxing system overall and the state contribution net of statewide education property tax overall. As I've been thinking a lot about this commission, one of the things that I keep coming back to is, and I'm sorry I missed Revenue's presentation last week, but I believe they made the point that, you know, the final dollar for education always comes from the property tax. But the final dollar for town funding comes from the property tax, the final dollar for county funding comes from the property tax, final dollar for village district funding, of which there are 2 in my town, come from property tax. And the state can lever up the statewide education property tax should it feel the need. So by my count, you have sort of 5 taxing entities that have unlimited levy ability, unlimited rate ability, and it's the final dollar we solve for the property tax. That doesn't need to be so. You know, that's the status quo. As I view the status quo is always a policy option. We don't need to defend or maintain the status quo in any way, shape, or form. So I'm thinking more broadly about the property taxing system. And that, like as a thought exercise, what if we solved the final dollar for education as a penny on the Meals and Rooms tax rate. You know, you could do that. You know, the state could give the final dollar, and we could somehow, you know, put guardrails around how much property taxes could go up or down in any given year, that type of thing. So there, you know, there's a lot of policy options out there as it relates to the property tax. I'm not saying we get into a Shaheen level investigation into capital gains taxes, personal income
That's
tax.
good information to
You know,
provide, right?
It's interesting, but I don't think we've got the time or the bandwidth to do that kind of stuff. But where the property tax is so front and center in education funding and local government funding generally in the state, I think, you know, by necessity, we need to take a look at the property tax, the relationship between the property tax and education funding.
But
And I
actually,
would
if
say in the 2000 report, some of the assumptions underlying that was 20 years ago. Some of the underlying assumptions about the property tax, I think we think differently about now. So that, I think that's a very interesting report, but 20 years and how much of those economic assumptions have changed, including the ones about the property tax and how it's assigned and the relationship between commercial and residential. There's so many things in that would be fodder for discussion.
So I just wanted to say that last point that both John and Chris made, I think actually also tees us up for next week. We're going to become familiar with this rich research and database that Reaching Higher New Hampshire has created that understands local capacity and the effect on local school districts and students. And the School Funding Fairness Project, represented by Doug Hall, will also be sharing some pretty rich and detailed and deep data as well. So next week we've sort of framed as data day, so we can really become familiar with what do we have locally, and then again, what is our external vendor need to augment that with. So
Great.
that's for next week.
All right,
And I forgot to assign anybody any homework,
I'm gonna find that.
but you'll be sending me some stuff about what committees you want to be on, what groups you want to be on.
So,
Send
great,
your email.
thank you very much, Bruce. We're good, and
Yes.
well, I'm gonna talk with a few people right now, so
Yeah.
I don't wanna hold anybody up, but do people like this, does this room work?
No,
Next week.
I think it'd be incorporated.
Yeah.
That screen made me see people way down there, that was in my own way.
I don't agree.
Okay,
It's,
let me ask Brian and Sarah, what did you guys think about this
it's
room?
huge.
Perfectly fine on my end.
But did it work for you?
The space for the public's a little tight.
Yeah,
that's true. Send it to the PRA.
Meals and Rooms.
Bill, how was it down at the table?
I think we'll go okay. Once I get confidence in the flow.
Yeah, I think we gotta work on that a little bit.
Meals and Rooms offer. I would never have access to the state. Some ideas I'll share with
So I need to go on watch a lot of people at the same time.
I'd like to, I mean,
Audio
did
on one side,
or, I mean, yeah, it's through our Facebook page, so if you have access to that, then we can be very happy. Yeah.
Alright, I didn't know, 'cause I tried it once, I gotta do it again next week, so.
Alright, well,
But I didn't know if it does come with the video.
yeah, it should, I don't know, I mean, technology wise,
Quick
it
works
would
with
be
the
for
sound,
like
like,
a
on the
laptop like Bruce.
Okay.
Super small.
But my technical, this is great, yeah.
Okay.
Has had negative local property tax rates, if you can believe it, i.e. Really the timber tax raises enough revenue to satisfy all local requirements. So you couldn't reduce the per pupil advocacy cost enough to make Millsfield meet.
That's why some of us now is
In my mind, you've got, Portsmouth, Multiborough,
Thank you.
you know, your castle.
Oh, yeah.
Property ranch, lots of people, but then you've got about a dozen or 2 dozen. I don't know what you do about under the portion. Under the portion. On property.
Well, yeah.